Fantastic. So I'll just start by explaining what I plan on covering in the seminar. So I'm going to be chatting about religion. Just in terms of my qualifications to be talking about the topic, I just want to be very transparent that I don't study religion at university. My main experiences with religion have been in a debate context, just arguing religion. I grew up in a religiously observant family, so I've thought about my own religious identity quite a bit. And I've taken a class at university about religion and sexuality that has been quite interesting in discussing ideas about religious reform and certain themes pertaining to the interaction between religion and social justice. Um, just if you have any questions that you would like me to cover, you can feel free to ask them in the chat at any point throughout the seminar. If I don't see it, you can just unmute and say if you have a question. And I'll also leave time if people want to ask questions at the end of the seminar. Once again, I probably won't be able to answer questions on like complex theology, which Google is probably better suited for, but like religion in a debate context, I could probably be a little bit more helpful. In terms of main things that I plan on covering, so I firstly want to just discuss arguments about the benefits and the harms of religion that are typically made in debate rounds and how to actually do those well and effectively, taking into account common mistakes that are typically made and explaining how the classic religion arguments become different when you talk about things like organized religion. Then I'm going to be talking about notions of religious reform. So for example, how to advance rights of women and LGBT plus people within religious movements, certain challenges in doing that, and certain examples of where that has been quite effective, which I think is quite a common theme in religion debates. And then finally, just some general trends about religion. So in which parts of the world is religion increasing, things like the new atheism movement, new religious movements, and how that's likely to manifest. Also, if at any point I'm talking too quickly and you'd like me to repeat something or just slow down in general, you can also just feel free to ask that in the chat. I'm happy to clarify any point that I made. Before I get into all of that, though, I just want to start out by making a key observation about what religious beliefs are that I've stolen from another religion seminar. I believe it was by Benji Coleman, although for the rest of my content, I've tried to make it different from other religion type debate stuff on the web. So the fundamental difference between religious beliefs and other kind of belief systems is the fact that people are a lot less likely to compromise on religious beliefs and other kind of beliefs. This is because most people believe in their religion regardless of the particular kind of proof that is given to them, especially because it's very hard to scientifically verify or to verify in any capacity whether religion exists or not. So therefore, people become grounded in claims like about God and the afterlife that you can only verify by yourself effectively. And therefore, it's substantially more likely that someone's belief in religion is going to be unwavering throughout the duration of their life, just because it's very hard for someone else to refute the legitimacy of their own religion. So unlike other beliefs, like what economic system you prefer, or even your political views that tend to be quite stubborn, religion is unique in the sense that people retain their religious identity for a far longer period throughout their life. And this is just I think an important observation that will make some of the other argumentation, I think, a little bit more persuasive and will help ground some of the other things that are being chatted about. Um, so in terms of the first major set of arguments that I want to discuss about just the typical benefits and harms of religion that are argued in debate motions overall. So I want to start by going through these set of arguments about why religion is good and important. I think that debating the merits of religion kind of comes up in two different kinds of motions. So firstly, there's the direct religion debate of this house regrets religion or this house regrets organized religion. But then in a lot of other religion debates, arguments about whether religion is beneficial or harmful typically come up. So things like the role of religion in politics, how much we should allow religion to exist in public spheres. A lot of these clashes just implicitly involve debating about whether religion is net harmful or whether it's net beneficial. So the first reason about why religion can be really important is that it gives people a sense of purpose. The important thing that you need to do in this argument is to differentiate the sense of identity that religion gives you relative to other kinds of belief systems. Because typically what's said when you're making this argument is that people who are on op are just going to say there's other ways you can access fulfillment in your identity. You could turn to your community, you could turn to your family, you could turn to extracurriculars, you could turn to a sense of spirituality. And I think as a consequence of that, you need to be able to identify what is unique about religion relative to other kinds of belief systems that are going to exist. So I think that there's a few ways you can try and argue about the uniqueness of religion. The first reason is that religion is not only about your present life, it is also about your afterlife. So given that it's literally about the afterlife as well, it provides a sense of permanence to your identity and a sense of longevity that other kinds of things typically don't. So I think that it becomes a lot more powerful to know that you're going to you can potentially access a sense of of eternal salvation, and the kind of hope that gives you, because it's about the afterlife rather than just the present, is something that's quite powerful. Secondly, and this relates to the framing that I said at the top, is that religion tends to be a lot less fleeting than other kinds of identity. So while your interests tend to change throughout your life in terms of who your friends are, who your community is, what activities you tend to enjoy, given that your religious identity tends to be a lot more constant, but also provides a unique sense of permanence because it's less wavering than other kinds of things within your life that can create a sense of internal crisis. So while crises of religion do take place with some people, those tend to be a lot less frequent than how much our other interests and our other identities can occasionally change. I think that the third reason about why religion is like uniquely important is that it can allow you to associate yourself with a sense of moral goodness. So it's not only that you are performing particular kinds of tasks that you are socially obliged to do. So for example, conforming to capitalism and like going to work every day, but it actually provides something that allows you to access a sense of like pleasing God and actually bringing a sense of internal joy into your own life. So like it's when you pray every day, when you follow the commandments that your religion demands, you can actually feel like you're a good person because you're doing something that God would approve of. So it can be a unique sense of identity in the sense that it's not just a passive one, but can also allow you to access a sense of morality and actually feel good about the kind of individual that you ultimately are. I think that the final thing that's unique to religion is a sense of community that it provides. While you can argue that there tend to be communities and other things, like if you're part of a sport, there might be community associating with that. You can make the claim that religious community tends to be uniquely powerful, both in terms of it's like logistically set up to you for a far larger extent. So like it's like the notion that every single Sunday I can go to my church group. There's often set dates within the religious calendar that specifically carve out time to appreciate the kind of sense of community versus forcing individuals to take the initiative to do that upon itself. So therefore, the community in that regard can effectively be a lot more constant than community that can come from other kinds of things when you're meeting similar people, when you know that you can expect that as kind of a key pillar of your life. You can also argue that a religious community is different because it tends to be a lot more powerful in terms of the number of people who subscribe to that. So it's like literally there's a significant proportion of the global population who prays to the same God, who shares very, very similar beliefs that you do. And it's a huge feeling that like you're not alone because you have like your brothers and your siblings who are part of your own religious group. So there's just like, I think that there's this very profound sense of like, there's so many other people who are like me subscribing to that same kind of religious system. So this is kind of the first kind of main argument of just like religion provides a unique sense of purpose. The second broad set of arguments about why religion is good is important is the fact that religion actually promotes good kinds of morality. I'll divide the discussion of this into two sections. So firstly, just about generally good things that religion promotes, and then secondly, a specific discussion about religion and charity and how to do that argument effectively. So in terms of how religion can just encourage morality more generally, you can make the claim that religious commandments tend to often enforce a variety of positive moral values. So the notion in Christianity that you should do unto others as you would want to be done to yourself. In Islam, the Prophet has said that kindness is a marker of faith. The fifth commandment in Judaism says that you should honor your father and to honor your mother. In the eighth commandment says that you should not steal. There are a bunch of like mitzvah within Judaism that specifically try and promote the idea of doing good. So notions of like not gossiping to others, of not taking revenge. The argument or the response that tends to be given to this argument in debate rooms about religion typically doing good things is like, atheists can also be moral. Why is a sense of morality inherent to a kind of religion, especially if people have other reasons to probably be moral within their own lives? I think you can reconcile this claim in a couple ways. So firstly, there are some things that are deemed to be immoral under a religious system, but those things are not illegal. So even if you would not do things like steal and commit murder, absent of religion, because there are laws and like basic levels of empathy that would promote that, there's often additional things that religion tries to promote. So doing more to help other people within your community, giving like more charity, helping your parents to a broader extent, these are often things that might be morally preferable, even though these things are often not deemed to be obligatory under the law, and our basic levels of empathy might not demand them to as large of an extent as to other kind of basic like moral things. I think that secondly, you can argue that substantially more people subscribe to religion or subscribe to religious morality, because not everyone would want to be good for like selfless reasons, given that we have other conflicting things within our lives, about like wanting to conform to capitalism, etc. And we tend to be generally selfish. But even for people who tend to be selfish for selfish reasons, people often do want to subscribe to religious conceptions of morality, because the more moral that you are under your particular religious system, the more that God is going to be pleased, the higher the probability that you're going to be able to access a sense of eternal salvation that could be really positive. So even if some people would behave in moral ways absent of religion, a larger number of people are going to behave in those moral ways when actually like you have the religious obligation to behave in those particular kind of ways. So this can just be a claim about general morality. But I think that secondly, there's a very important claim that religion tends to uniquely motivate important kinds of charity. So the response that is often given to this is that there's really important kinds of charities that exist absent of religion. Why is religious charity unique when you also have other non-for-profit organizations who are doing things like building soup kitchens and who are generally trying to donate money? I think that you can argue that religious charity is unique for two key reasons, which is, I think, a link that's often missed in these kind of debates. And the first is that substantially more people engage in religious charity than in other kinds of charity, for a similar analysis that I gave in the previous argument about morality of just religion often demands charity in a way that other moral systems do not. So in nearly every single religion, and you might want to Google some of these just so you have examples about when, like, according to religious theology and like religious texts, it demands you give to like charity. Most mainstream religions demand this in some kind of way. So within the New Testament Bible passages, there's the phrase, the Lord Jesus wants us to practice benevolent or charitable giving. The Bible teaches that the liberality of God's blessings to us is connected to the liberality of our Christian giving. The Buddhists have a required action called dana. This concept includes giving, sharing, and selfless giving without anticipation of return or benefit to the giver. Zakat is the third pillar of Islam, which is giving for those Muslims whose incomes are at a particular level, and it is considered to be a purifying kind of tax. So just like within the vast majority of religions, there tends to be some demand to actually give to charity. I think an example of how powerful the religious motivation to give to charity is that 73% of American giving goes to religious-related organizations. So what this demonstrates is that even if there would be some charity absent of religion, the sheer quantity of giving that you're going to have is just so much larger when it's done through a religious context. The second reason why religious charity tends to be unique is that they just have a lot more organizational power relative to other kinds of charities. So when you donate to religion, it's often going to centralized institutions who have certain planning and to have certain experiences. Wait, give me 1 second to see the chat. Yep. The video is going to be recorded and it's going to be posted in a few weeks. So collective action problems that tend to be associated with normal charitable giving of different people have different priorities and they donate to different charities can be overcome with religion to a larger extent. So especially when you have like larger churches or larger religious organizations, money is often pooled into a single institution because it's often demanded that congregants of a particular like religious organization will donate to a centralized church. What this means is that when it comes to religion, you often have a larger pool of money that is centralized within a single place. And you can make the claim that an economy of scale, or in other words, having a lot of money centralized in a single location is very important when it comes to effective charity, because a lot of charitable projects are just very expensive. So things like building schools or building orphanages or even building new well projects, a lot of these things have relatively high demands in terms of the amount of capital that you need. And therefore, when you centralize that into a single place, you are better able to engage in the most effective kinds of charities. That's kind of how you make the religious and charity argument. I think that the final thing that you can argue that I think is probably less central than the other things, but it's important in historical religion debates, is that religion did spearhead certain innovation in historical developments. So there's often the claim that's made that like innovation exists oppositionally to science. But I think that you can actually make the claim that, firstly, the vast majority of religion is not inherently anti-science in nature in all regards. In fact, the vast majority of religions do believe that we have a basic level of free will and therefore will give us the ability to innovate. But I think that a really like interesting example about when religion was important for historical kinds of innovation is that in the Middle Ages and in early modern Europe, religious schools were often the only way that people could access a sense of primary and secondary education. So states and kingdoms had an incentive to keep people in the dark and did not want them to be well read because that would challenge political power. But it was actually religious organizations who spearheaded the vast majority of early modern education. And even though a lot of this education was like religious in nature, it did help massively expand education to the masses to a larger extent. So I think it was just like in a historical debate, it's just like a good example of when religion actually did help promote a sense of innovation and of increased learning. So on the flip side, there's arguments you can make about why religion tends to be problematic. So the first way that you can often argue that religion tends to be problematic is that there is just a link that exists between religion and a link that exists between conflict. The response that is typically given to this is like, but why is conflict inherent to religion in any kind of way? Conflict occurs for a bunch of other reasons because political leaders massively have the incentive to go to conflict anyways because they often want things like increased access to material kinds of resources. There's a few ways that you can make the claim that forms of conflict might be worsened by religion. Firstly, there can be direct kinds of conflict over religious sites themselves. So I think that Jerusalem is an example of a contested religious site which can fuel forms of conflict within itself. There's also often forms of like temples that are contested between religious groups in terms of who has the right to control those and whether they are legitimate. Secondly, religion tends to be built around notions of internal exclusivity. So that is to say, there's often pressure within religions to demonize other religions in order to shore up the legitimacy of your own religion and of your own religious base. So in order to kind of encourage people to stay in your religion, but also to prove to them that your religion is the best one, a way that religious leaders often try and do that is to criticize other religions, to say that's not truly what God would want. And therefore you end up building a mentality of people within that religion that other people are infidels. Only people within my religion are going to go to heaven. Only people within my religion are correct, but also a hatred of people outside of that structure who are seen as violating what the true will of God ultimately is. Finally, you can make the claim that conflict is more inherent to a religion because there tends to be schisms and divides within particular kinds of religions themselves. So an example of this would be the Sunni-Shia divide within Islam, where over time there can be splits about what the correct conception of theology ultimately is. And you can argue that internal divides within religion tend to be very, very bad in promoting conflict because these are people who used to agree with you and who share similar baselines of their ideologies, but are now literally contradicting that. So it's not someone of a different religion. It's literally someone who you think is like corrupting the like spirituality and the truth of what your own religion ultimately is, that can often create unique kinds of hatred. Another example of that historically would just be the Reformation within like Christianity in general. So in terms of some unique examples of religion fueling conflict. So the Crusades were 8 major military expeditions that originated in Western Europe between 1096 and 1270. With the purpose of recapturing Palestine from the Muslims because it was the area where Jesus had lived. This is an example of a religious conflict. The 30 Years' War was a 17th century religious conflict fought primarily in Central Europe, which started as a battle between Catholic and Protestant states that formed the Holy Roman Empire. The French Wars of Religion were a prolonged period of war and popular unrest between Catholics and Huguenots. I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly. So there's just like a lot of historical examples of conflict. There's just a question I'm going to look at quickly. Okay, so I'll answer the religious, so there was a motion about religion in the justice system. I'll answer that at the end of the seminar. So restating the headers of the 4 claims. Oh, no, there were only 3. I might have said 4 by accident, but I did only go over 3. Another way that you can nuance this claim slightly more is that, so like once again, as I flagged at the beginning, the response is often there were so many other justifications in which conflict could also take place. I think that you can make the argument that if leaders are making the active choice to turn to religion as a primary justification, it probably means that other justifications were not going to be as effective if you're literally utilizing religion. So it might be the case that leaders could try and claim intervening in this other state might be good for forms of profitability and like we can get resources from abroad. I think you can make the claim that like fewer people would have bought into those other kinds of justification than the sheer number of people who buy into religious justifications that leaders often use for conflict, because there are often simply more people within that state who subscribe to religion. But it's often the case that leaders frame this in a way that like God or morality demands that we intervene in this other kind of state. So I think a useful illustration of this that I'll expand on even later is that during mid-colonialism, philosophers like Locke and Kane were rejecting colonialism for moral reasons. But I think that you can make the claim that religious justifications in particular allowed that process to occur for a longer period of time because it was uniquely powerful relative to other kinds of justifications that leaders used. So I guess this can kind of map you like a conception of a fourth reason of just it's a more persuasive claim that leaders can use, even if they would try and use other claims as well. So that's kind of the link between religion and conflict. Secondly, in terms of arguing why religion is bad, you can make the fairly classic argument that religion is just bad for people inside of it. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but it's basically just the idea that there are certain minorities within religious structures that are marginalized by religion because religious theology just tends to marginalize them to a larger extent. So a lot of religions saying that LGBT people are going to burn in hell, and generally being against trans people, women in Saudi Arabia needing male guardians to accompany them whenever they go, Catholics supporting female genital mutilation, basically just to claim that minorities within religion are often sidelined. I don't think that too many examples of this are needed because this claim tends to be more intuitive. The one thing that I'll note about how to make this argument more effectively is that it's very important to like weigh it in the context of a debate round. So what I mean by that is that if you make the claim that like women or LGBT plus people are harmed in religious structures, but another team in the debate proves that like massive numbers of people are also able to benefit from those, it's often unclear why we should prioritize a particular minority within that religious structure relative to the like sheer numerical majority of other people who can find fulfillment in that. Particularly if forms of oppression toward marginalized groups might still occur in a secular society. I think the way that you can weigh this claim very highly is based on two things. So number one, the extremity of what oppression within religion means. So in the same way that notions of the afterlife can be important in helping to provide people with a sense of fulfillment, they can also be actively damaging. Because if you truly believe that you're going to burn in hell, this also means that like the emotional consequence of that is something that's quite terrible. But secondly, religion tends to be, or another way that you can weigh these like minority groups, that there just tends to be a lot of them. So there's so many categories that religion has historically precluded, whether you are a woman, LGBT plus, oftentimes even a racial minority, who are often not included as well in certain religions and who experience forms of discrimination. Even if like the individual numerical might of each minority who is treated poorly under religion is small, a lot of people within religion, often with the exception of like more privileged white men. I think like the poor is another example of people who are often marginalized in religion because they cannot meet religious expectations of indulgences or of charity to as large of an extent. Like so many people experience marginalization under religion in the sense that one part of their identity is viewed as being religiously illegitimate. Therefore, you should weigh the holistic value of that group quite highly. So that's kind of how you make that argument. Thirdly, you can argue that religious morality itself is something that tends to be harmful. So this is basically the previous argument that I gave, except applied to a wider societal scale. So it's the fact that religious organizations have massive kinds of social influence, often because they were involved in early kinds of state formation that occurred in the vast majority of states, where there was like a linkage and an intermixing between the church and between the state. So you can argue that that, in addition to the fact that religious organizations often comprise of powerful lobbying groups where they donate a lot of money that impacts politics, is that this is institutionalized LGBT plus discrimination to a larger extent, conversion therapy, negative attitudes toward birth control, and it's kind of led to these things existing on a wider societal level that harm marginalized groups. So I think that how you make this claim, which is directly exists in contrast to the positive kind of morality that I explained earlier, is that under either side of the house, there's going to be a baseline level of morality that exists even absent of religion. Number one, you can just use intuition pumps about how we have natural inclinations to want to be empathetic people using like evolutionary analysis, or just like other kinds of examples about when during times of crisis, we tend to come together for non-religious reasons. And also that there tends to be laws to kind of constrain like the worst excesses of our actions. So therefore, the comparative is not do we want morality to exist, but it's whether religion exerts a net positive or a net negative effect on how we conceive of morality. And given that religion often supports so many of these problematic ideals, you can argue that it's negative in that regard. And you can also make the claim that it's harder to challenge religious conceptions of morality for the reason I gave right at the top of my seminar of just you can't really have proof that religion is something that's incorrect. And therefore, religious morality tends to exist for longer periods of time, even when general social mores and social norms are progressing at a faster rate. So, i.e., the average person has a more favorable view toward LGBT plus people than the average member of like a religion, which, just to be very clear, is not to say that religion is inherently oppressive toward LGBT plus communities, but on average, rates of social progressiveness tend to evolve asymmetrically. I just had a question that I'm going to look at briefly. Sorry, just give me like 30 seconds to process the questions. Okay, so there were two questions. So one is, are some of the links between religion and conflict less true for less dogmatic and non-Judeo-Christian religions? I would say absolutely. That's probably something that is true. Like Jainism, Buddhism, etc., probably don't engage in as many kinds of conflict. I think that you can make the claim, like it depends on the kind of religion debate, but often you can just make the claim like most people within the world are part of like mainstream religions rather than or like of like Judeo-Christian religions rather than other kinds of religions, and therefore a lot of the kind of facets of conflict argumentation still applies. But I definitely don't think that conflict is inherent to like religious theology itself. And then there's another question of oftentimes religion acts as an entity that has an incentive to keep morality as it is rather than to let it evolve. How can we deal with this trade-off if we want to take an approach of agreeing with the aforementioned fact, or why is morality evolving as quickly and absent of religion not preferable? So I think that the way that you kind of contest with like the trade-off of but morality is going to involve slower with religion is number one, you can use mitigation of like how bad really is religious morality. Even though there are some facets of this that are harmful, it doesn't mean that on net it is harmful. And then you can use the mitigation or like the argumentation that I gave earlier in the seminar about how it actually encourages a lot of things that are morally nice, like in general being more charitable or looking after your parents, that can often cancel out the more negative things that it stands for. So it evolving at a slower pace is less bad given all the good things that it supports as well. And then secondly, this will make up like the next portion of my seminar. But you can make the claim that religious morality is actually not as stagnant as most people say. It does have massive incentives to actually evolve, and I'll cover some of the ways that has happened in the next section. I hope that answered your question. I was a little bit confused about the one I just answered. If it didn't, just send me another PM and I'll clarify that again. Okay, fantastic. There's just a couple more reasons about the argumentation about why religion is net harmful. Firstly, you can make the claim that religion is bad because it just constrains your identity. The premise of this argument is quite an intuitive one of just people deserve the maximal amount of agency over their lives, and they should be free to effectively construct their own identities. The reason for this is that people don't have fixed preferences. We are all unique, independent beings, and therefore we can maximize our own happiness and our own personhood if we can choose ends for ourselves. You can argue that religion has a variety of rules that we have to follow that inherently decreases the sense of autonomy. So it often instructs what clothes and what garments you have to wear. It bans you from eating certain kinds of foods. It restricts who you're able to marry, who you're able to get divorced from, and whether you can actually get divorced in the first place, the number of kids you can have by doing things like imposing restrictions on birth control. As a consequence of that, an entirely arbitrary sense of our identity that is just random based on the parents that we were born into and the community that we live in exerts a massive quantity of influence over our own lives. And you can argue that that within itself is both a principle wrong, but also decreases our utility because we cannot choose the kind of life practices that would actually otherwise be the most meaningful for us. Next claim, you can make the claim that religion has led to harmful developments throughout human history, which is like the flip of the education claim. So it's decreased the time juncture in which, it delayed the period in human history in which science was developed, is like the main claim here. So it locked Galileo up for saying that the earth revolves around the sun rather than the sun revolves around the earth. Illness was often seen as being something that was like spiritually condemn certain people who are non-believers rather than something that was actually deserving of attention to try and fix. So all of these factors led to science being developed at a slower pace, and you can just weigh that in terms of why scientific innovations are really important and why having those earlier would have been really valuable. Finally, religion just often justified really terrible things. So it was used to justify slavery. It was used to justify colonialism. Insert similar analysis here that I gave in the conflict argument of yes, there are other justifications, but because religion was such a powerful one, it tended to prolong these highly, highly immoral kinds of social practices for just like a longer period of time. Okay, almost done this section about the general harms and benefits. I just want to make one observation about a debate motion that tends to come up about this that's slightly different. So there's often a motion that comes up of this house prefers a world without organized religion. The arguments that I gave become slightly different when it's under a framework of do we prefer organized religion or do we prefer not having religion altogether? Because with organized religion, the clash is often do we prefer religion as it exists under the status quo with churches, with mosques, with a lot of people subscribing to a religious leader and then other people believing in that, or to a more individualized conception of religion where people tend to decide what religion means for themselves. And this clash, you can modify the arguments in a few ways. So firstly, there's a clash about whether you get higher levels of spirituality when you have more freedom to choose what religion means for you. Or do you need an imagined kind of community to feel that sense of joy? So do you need millions of other people around the world believing in the same religious system that you do to feel like your own religious identity is actually validated? And you can make the claim that you absolutely do, because the importance of religion is inherently influenced by society. We are social creatures. Our own identity is often legitimized substantially more when we see other people subscribing to a similar kind of identity. And then there's a different clash about the nature of hierarchies. So do hierarchies tend to promote more radicalism because you often appoint people who are increasingly more conservative, or is individualized interpretation absent of hierarchies going to lead to more radicalism? There's a claim about like the us them mentality of disliking other people tied to religion. And there's also a distinct clash about whether the comparative absence of this would be a larger emphasis on ethnicity or on race or other arbitrary identities. Like you can make the claim that group formation is quite inherent to the human psyche, because from a psychological perspective, we often want to see how we are positioned within the world in terms of we want other people to subscribe to the same belief system as us just to make us feel better about ourselves. But you can also just give evolutionary reasons about how we kind of evolved to want to travel in packs and to exist with similar ideas to other people. And then you can just make the claim like, is religion or other kinds of identities becoming more prominent worse? So just bear in mind that the clash within the organized religion motion is different from the typical clashes about whether religion is positive or negative. Are there any questions on that before I move to the next section of the seminar about religious reform? Okay, fantastic. So now to chat about religious reform. So while it's true that religions often evolve at a relatively slow pace, religions can evolve in a couple key ways. So the first way is external factors that just impact a religion absent to people who are inside of that religion. So in general, is society becoming more progressive? There can often be the interaction between religion and other kinds of ideologies. So how does nationalism interact with religion to shape the way that religion operates? How do other religions impact other religions? They can also be impacted by practical things like the evolution of technology. So external factors, even if there's not an internal push to shape that religion, can often impact how it evolves. And then secondly, religion can also evolve through internal pushes of just people within that religion desiring particular things, and then they can use things like collective action to actually change the way that a particular religious structure operates. That being said, this kind of evolution tends to be quite slow for two reasons. Number one, most religions tend to follow structures that are quite hierarchical in nature. So within religion, how the vast majority are established is that there tends to be a person at the top. I mean, obviously, like God tends to be like the main thing at the top, but like below that, like within Catholicism, for example, there's the Pope, and then there's people below the popes, and then there's priests, and there's like lower people within individual churches. And most religions operate in a similar kind of hierarchy. This slows down reform because there's often, firstly, people at the top of that hierarchy are often within theology believed to have access to God's kind of mentality and to what God thinks. And therefore, you don't really have a huge impetus to question people who are so regarded and so venerated within religious structures, given the tremendous morality that they are seen to possess. But also, for people who want to advance up the religious hierarchy, there's massive kinds of pressure not to question what those embedded norms are. So most religion internal appointment structures don't work democratically, but they work via like someone higher up within a religious structure appointing lower people within that structure. And as a consequence, like, sorry for the unsophisticated language, there's almost an incentive to like suck up to people who exist higher up in the religious hierarchy in order to guarantee that you yourself are able to advance within that system. If that is something that you want to do, and you often do want to do that because there's often material resources in terms of like living in nicer places, but also you're often told that you are pleasing God substantially more. It's way that you can get prestige within your community, especially in communities that struggle to access prestige in areas that exist outside of religion. And that you can just make the claim that people who exist at the top of religious hierarchies tend to be overwhelmingly conservative white men, which is just a characterization that is true, and therefore they tend to be quite regressive, even if the average person within religion would ideally want or aspire to different things. So that's like the first reason, is the nature of hierarchies. And then the second reason just links back to, once again, the framing that I gave at the top of the speech of what you believe to be true in religion cannot really be shaped to as large of an extent. You cannot really challenge the initial word of God, especially because of how long ago like initial documents tend to take place. And therefore, religious traditions tend to last for what are basically thousands of years because of how hard that questioning process actually is. Sorry, my throat's getting dry. I'll be back in like 20 seconds. So this is just like how you classically just argue this clash of like it's possible because it can be shaped by internal and external factors, but it's also often slow and difficult. The next thing I want to do here is then just give a bunch of examples about where religious reform has happened. The vast majority of these either come from my university course or just from my own research, because I am quite fascinated by religion. So one interesting example of reform is the ordination of women within Catholicism, which started in the 1970s. I'm sure, sorry, I'm not sure if it was Catholicism, it might have just been Christianity in general. Where basically like women were allowed to become priests. A massive push for how this reform was able to take place was a grassroots movement called the Movement for the Ordination of Women, MOW, which is an organization which campaigned for the ordination of women as deacons and priests in the Church of England. So this is a useful example of when the push to reform religion came from people like inside of those religious structures itself. Something that's interesting is that when this took place, there was massive backlash that came from other people within it. So many churches broke away from the Anglican Communion. There were many evangelicals who became more radical and more conservative after this took place, and there was kind of a schism that was created. This is useful because religious reform, even if it happens, is not necessarily going to be effective in actually changing norms within what that religion actually are, in the sense that it's often difficult to like persuade people that the new kind of religious norm is correct relative to one that was embedded for decades and for thousands of years, especially if that reform is being headed from more grassroots movements rather than people who are at the top of those hierarchies. And especially if like radical people become more radical, there's also a harm that occurs in addition to like the more positive kind of reform that is taking place. A second example of reform that's also being spearheaded from a grassroots perspective is the non-binary Hebrew project. Sorry, there's just a comment. Okay, there's a direct message about like something that Hamza said. I promise that I will try to deal with that after I get through the section about examples of reform. So another example of kind of a grassroots level change is the non-binary Hebrew project. So this is a website that serves as a comprehensive guide to gender-neutral Hebraic pronouns and also outlines biblical precedent for transgender and for non-binary identities. So in Hebrew, there are adjectives and verbs that have different endings to align with the subject's gender, which clearly creates problems for people who are gender fluid or who are non-binary. So both queer rabbis, but also this particular group, has played a role in advocating for the institutional acceptance of same-sex marriage and the rights for LGBT plus Jews within Reform, Reconstructionist, and conservative denominations. Orthodox Judaism is the only branch that doesn't actually accept homosexuality within Judaism, although there are often still forms of like microaggressions and other kinds of discrimination in other branches. In addition to trying to push for LGBT plus acceptance in general, this group has also explored biblical evidence for gender nonconformity, like the use of female grammar in several verses that described Adam, Noah, and Joseph. And they've also used a particular kind of philosophy that Talmud rabbis have used of those who are willing to make radical moves, sometimes uprooting the Torah itself, but basically just tries to establish precedent for like reinterpreting the Torah and like other kinds of Jewish documents. So I think it's interesting to look to how it's not only just about saying like people deserve rights, but it's also often about looking to like historical kinds of documents and then reinterpreting those documents in such a way that becomes more inclusive for people in those kinds of religious structures. Another example within Judaism is just like Jewish feminist theology. There's a huge Jewish feminist music scene, spearheaded by women like Debbie Friedman and Linda Hirschhorn. I might be pronouncing her name incorrectly, which just like created a lot of Jewish feminist music that was quite interesting. Another example of reform within religion is women as imams within Islam. So like it's often characterized in debates that Islam is inherently oppressive toward women. That is absolutely not true. Muslim women have actually been featured as key theological figures throughout the history of Islam. And historically, there were certain sects that did consider it acceptable for women to function as imams, and it was often drew from this particular theology, which meant that in 2005, there was a female imam in New York who led the Friday prayer. And even though there were like some protesters who gathered outside, she broadly did receive support from Muslim academics. So I think these are all just useful examples of to use in debate rounds of religion is not just stagnant. Change often does take place to actually accommodate what the interests of people within that religion are. Okay. This is slightly different from the general reform clash, but I also just want to talk briefly about whether women can be empowering for like women overall. And give a couple examples of where it can be, because I think that the flip side of that, i.e. like Saudi Arabia analysis, is often used substantially more. Okay, I'm back. Sorry about the delay. So what I want to do now is give a couple examples of how religion can be empowering for women, absent of classic like non-Judeo-Christian religion examples. So I think that firstly, certain religions have a unique role for shamanism that is inherent to empowering women. So shamanism basically means like a shaman is someone who is perceived as having unique kinds of connections to the spiritual world. And in a lot of religions that have shamanism, women are often shamans. They're often seen to have a unique kind of spirituality. And this is important because this does a couple things that help women. Number one, it can help protect women against the expectations of men and offer an effective vehicle in allowing them to manipulate husbands and relatives without directly challenging male authority. So I think an example of where shamanism tends to be quite prevalent is that there was a revival of shamanism in the 1980s throughout Korea. And in 2013, it was estimated that 1 out of every 160 South Koreans was a shaman, or like not was a shaman, but who like subscribed to it. And as a consequence of that, given that there are certain women who exist within this role, it provides them a vehicle for effective kinds of manipulation without directly challenging forms of patriarchal structures. Another example of where women can find empowerment is women as cell leaders in the Yodo Full Gospel Church. So this is a church, like a newer church that was created. And women are often cell leaders, which means that they lead home meetings, they train new assistants, are able to create new cells. And there's basically the idea that women can have a place when they are these cell leaders to organize community meetings absent of their husbands, and to engage and to interact and to discuss religion and to discuss their lives with other kinds of women. So even if from a conventional sense, women often have less power within religion relative to men, there are certain rules in certain religions that are reserved uniquely for women that does actually give them like a relatively higher level of influence and of control. So this is mostly what I have to say about religion and reform. I'll try and answer the question that was asked now. Okay, so basically the question is that what Hamza says, another like a fantastic debater you probably know, he says that people actually do compromise on religious beliefs, which is like why there are biologists who are religious, etc. I mean, I think that yes, like neither of the claims are absolute of everyone not changing their religious views and a lot of people being very flexible with how religion interacts with other kinds of their identity. I think that you can make the claim that if you want to argue that a lot of people don't compromise their religious beliefs, that like even if there are some people who are willing to, like the majority of people just don't, because of how difficult it actually is to like have those beliefs internally to you proven to be incorrect, but also in terms of like theological links and how initial beliefs are often seen as being true. But on the flip side, I think that Hamza's observation, in addition to the why reform is possible analysis, can be used to show that religious beliefs tend to be substantially more flexible, especially increasing with like the modern age and increasing secularization, which is what I'm about to talk about in like the next portion of the seminar as well. So in terms of, this brings me then to like the next section about certain religious trends that exist under the status quo, which will be the last section of the seminar. So one trend that exists is the rise of new religious movements. So 92% of the global population does belong to four major faiths: Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam. That being said, there are other religions who do occasionally form that have different ideologies from like the mainstream kinds of religion. That being said, there are a lot of barriers for new religious movements to ultimately form. So in many countries, such as Indonesia, new religions are quite literally illegal. People often have biases in favor of traditional claims that are seen as being legitimate and began 1,000 or 2,000 years ago. There's often a lack of state sponsorship for new religions that existed for religions a lot more historically. And then there's also competition with historical religions to actually retain followers. So they are not frequent, but there are some examples of newer religious movements. So an example of this would be Mila Abraham, which was a new religion that started in Indonesia. It had around 50,000 followers before it was shut down by the state. Jehovah's Witnesses, which is kind of a component of Christianity that you might have heard of, are considered to be a new religious movement. That being said, in addition to like religious movements that resemble traditional religions to a larger extent, there are also more of like cult types of new religious movements. So like Jim Jones, who led mass suicides, or movement for the restoration of the 10 Commandments of God in Uganda. There are types of new religious movements that are also like suicide type cultings. So definitely characterized like a spectrum of new religious movements that exist. Another major trend that's occurring is increasing secularization around the world over time. So since 2007 in particular, there has been a remarkable trend away from religion, particularly in higher income countries. This is different from the trend that occurred after the collapse of the Soviet Union, where rates of religiosity tended to rise. What's important is that from 2007 to 2019, only 5 countries became more religious, whereas the vast majority of countries moved in the opposite direction. That being said, This trend has not been entirely symmetric in the sense that the developing world has remained a lot more religious than the developed world has. I think it's quite unique to ponder why this discrepancy has existed. So, number one, you can make the argument that the benefits of religion in terms of community and in terms of a sense of belonging become a lot more powerful when you have fewer resources and more material deprivation, because you want religion to feel hope and to actually feel like you have a broader sense of control over your own life. Secondly, in poorer countries, religious institutions often provide essential services like education and healthcare that can then increase elements of buy-in. And then finally, more education can be a factor that can decrease religiosity, given that science often does contradict the tenets of religions. So in societies that have less access to religion, you often have more people who subscribe to religion and to religious movements overall. So as a consequence, you can make the claim, this is very important for characterization and debate rounds, that religion is decreasing, but not everywhere. And you can use this frame to explain the importance of religion within the developing world, where just more people tend to be religious overall. The final trend that I would like to observe is, there's two more. So one is the rise of the new atheist movement. So it's not only that people are becoming less religious, it's that there's also a militant faction of atheists who are staunchly against religion. So these are intellectuals like Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, and Samuel Harris, who are a lot more like staunchly opposed to religion. New atheists don't only believe that that religion is not good, but they believe it should be actively criticized, and they've taken a much more militant stance to actually opposing religion and to opposing what that means. In a debate round, you can argue this is harmful because, number one, it has contributed to perpetuating quite a lot of Islamophobia. So a lot of the things that Samuel Harris has said has been taken and then construed as being Islamophobic. And then also, if you buy that criticisms of religion are important, having like militant people who are saying that religious people are stupid and irrational is probably not a good way to actually get social buy-in to what those criticisms are. On the other hand, you can try and make the claim that this has actually platformed really important criticisms of what religion is, because it's gotten A, more media attention, and then B, it's associated with like a larger sense of intellectualism and what that actually means. A final trend that's important is increasing extremism and the rise of religious attacks. So examples of this are the 2020 attack in Vienna, where there were a series of shootings that occurred in November of 2020. The Nice attack in France, where 3 people were died in an attack at a church, and then the beheading of the French teacher Samuel Paty. Note that it's not only like Islamic extremism that has been increasing in the past few months. There've also been a lot of other attacks. There've been broadly like an increase of anti-Semitism and attacks at synagogues, and then also the like mosque shooting in New Zealand is another example of just extremism increasing overall. I'm sorry that my voice dying slightly. When I talk for too long, it happens. If anyone has any questions about anything in the seminar, now would be a great time to ask. You could also PM me questions after this, and I'll happily get back to you as well. Is it possible to characterize atheism as a religion? That's interesting. I think probably. If you say that religion is basically an ideology, at its core that people mutually believe in, and atheism is like a mutual disbelief in God, I guess you could, especially if you can identify a common denominator of like other things that like atheists believe. That being said, I don't think judges would necessarily buy that. I think actually it might be easier to characterize like new atheism as being a religion within itself, because at that point you get a much more like militant kind of congregation around a particular ideology, and you can argue that a strong belief in ideology is like quite central to what religion actually is and to what it actually stands for.